It's a pleasure to be here today with you, now taking a different role than my usual. But I'm here to introduce John, who is the founder and chief pollinator at Volans, and they integrate future thinking, sustainability, and innovation into corporate strategy. They also try to lead people from uncertainty to action, which I think has been a theme today, and they believe that business can be a force for good. He is also the author of 21 books, the most latest one, Trickling Sharks. They are bestsellers that have shaped the world of sustainability in the past decades. Which is also very impressive that he's capable to inspire into action a young industrial engineer Brazilian, thank you, and also key top senior CEOs all over the world. All of that, you could know online, right? You could search him and you would find that, but getting to know him a little bit in person also revealed someone who is deeply curious, a genuine connector, very passionate, and not afraid to be called an activist. John is 75, but he said he's just starting, but as we're going to see today, he has lots to share with us. So please, John, welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Fernanda. Hello, everyone. Thanks, James, too. James asked me before I came up on the stage, do you get nervous before these sorts of things? And I said, I do, a little, but not as much as I once would have done. But I also look at audiences, and watching you all through the morning session was quite instructive. You were all paying attention. You were all interested. I think you're all, in one way or another, on a learning curve. And I'm going to say a little more than just a few words, but I'm going to try and give you a perspective on where I think this agenda of ours is going to go, and why regeneration as language is so important in where we're headed next. So, this is an obvious image, you know where it is, but I was asked to give a helicopter view. So expect that sort of altitude as I go through. Trump has some interesting best friends. His latest one is Elon Musk. I'm just reflecting on the fact that whether we like it or not, we have another 3 to 4 years of great uncertainty. But my point is going to be, as I go through the presentation, that I don't think this is going to be massively consequential. Whatever the Trump administration manages to achieve during its period in office, or mayhem, whatever we call it, underlying all of this, there is a shift, a transition, a transformation, which various people in the audience have already referred to. And just to give you a sense of where I'm headed in all of this, regeneration as language, I think, is on the rise. I think it's very powerful. It's very meaningful to people. It's optimistic. I think your sector, in all of its complexity, can take a lead, and congratulations to the Roundtable for what it has done, what it is doing, and critically today, what it might do next. And the timing, for a bunch of different reasons, and I'll try and explain that, is more or less perfect for a lead to be taken in this space. But we've all heard it, and multiple languages, multiple concepts and terminologies being used in this space, which is often an alibi for busy CEOs and other business leaders to say, go away and sort it out among yourselves. And once you've decided what exactly you want us to do, come back and tell us. Regeneration is in there. If this looks complex to you today, get ready for more complexity, because what's happening, despite Trump, despite right-wing politicians in different parts of the world, this agenda, this change agenda, whatever we call it, is coming smack bang into the mainstream. And what that means is everyone wants their own branding, they all want their own language, they all want their positioning, so more complexity, I think, is pretty much guaranteed. I'll skip that one. So just to give you some sense of what sort of discount factor you can apply to what I'm about to say. Yes, I'm 75. I've been 50 years this year professionally in firstly the environmental and then sustainability spaces. I've set up 4 social businesses, we would now call them, since 1978. They all still exist. The third one, sustainability, which we set up in 1987, is now owned by KKR. If somebody had told me when we were first setting that business up that private equity would end up owning it, I would have jumped out of a nearby window. But now, to me, it's a reflection of the fact that this is mainstreaming into markets, whether we like it or not. And served on a lot of boards and advisory boards, which has been the most amazing experience and set of learning curves. That's the latest book. And as Fernanda kindly said, I just think the next 10 to 15 years are going to be spectacularly exciting, challenging, and politically dangerous. So I'm going to discuss a little bit of that in a moment, but I wouldn't miss it for the world. And when people say, how can you possibly be optimistic in the midst of what we see happening in different parts of the world, whether it's Ukraine or whether it's Gaza or whether it's wherever it is? In 1994, the same year that I came up with the triple bottom line, people, planet, and profit, I sat down with a couple of colleagues and started to map the societal pressure waves, firstly on government, then on business, now increasingly on financial markets. And what you see in these grey lines, the top ones, are the macroeconomic trends. What you see in the orange line is the societal pressure waves. So they go up and they go down and they come up again. What you'll notice, perhaps, is the peaks are getting higher and the gaps between the peaks are shrinking the whole time. So actually we're going into a recession, both on ESG, environment, social and governance, and potentially sustainability as well. But I actually think that's necessary. I think it's healthy. That those recessions, those down waves, are where the bulk of the really useful work happens. And then underlying all of this, the paradigm in which we've all grown up with, and we take for granted, is shifting. And one of the things I learned from reading about paradigm shifts back in the 1960s was they go quite steadily for quite a long time, maybe 50, maybe 60, maybe almost 70 years, and then they go like that. They go absolutely perpendicular. And that's why I think the next 10 to 15 years are going to be so interesting. So the question is, do we want to be on this wave of change together, and what would that imply? I just want to pick out, these are some of the people that we work with. I'll pick out one example here. Perhaps some of you know EcoVadis. When I joined them in 2007 on their advisory group, there were 6 people. They were tracking maybe 30 or 40 businesses around the world. It's now 1,700 people tracking over 130,000 businesses. And I think that's just one indicator of the way in which change is happening. And I just wanted to put up this. It's already been referenced this morning, but this idea that the sustainability, the change agenda can be win-win, everyone can benefit. It's not true. And I just want to make the point that there are going to be a lot of people along the way who are going to lose, and we've got to do our very best to try and identify who they're going to be and try and make them feel a little bit happier than they're currently feeling. So this is European farmers protesting climate and pesticide regulation. We've seen heat pumps in Germany. We've seen all sorts of different elements of pushback, and maybe the Trump administration is yet another example of that at scale. Meanwhile, the financial markets are really struggling still with this agenda of ours. This was Stuart Kirk of HSBC a couple of years ago, just saying, really, if you're in the financial markets, you're an investor, it's not part of your business to care whether Miami or Florida are going to be underwater by 2100. Why should you bother? And I think he did he lost his job, but he did as a service just by pointing out that capitalism is intentionally, willfully blind in some respects. So we've really got to address the financial context. So in the midst of all of that, why optimistic? Well, it's not because we've now got over 6,000 chief sustainability officers. I've met a couple of here today. It's not because Mattel have done Barbie dolls showing a chief sustainability officer, a wildlife specialist, a protester, and a renewable energy engineer. I mean, this is sort of progress. I don't play with Barbies. Our daughters didn't either. But I think this is an indicator that this mainstreaming is happening in a bunch of different ways. Here's another example. And I spent 40 years now trying to get business, companies, supply chains to be more transparent. So I could look at this diagram and think, with the CSRD about to give it a good sharp push, the fact that we're now up to, 96% of major companies around the world doing sustainability reports of one sort or another, you could call that progress. But who is actually using the reported information and data to create the market and system level intelligence that we actually will need? And the answer is not enough people are yet doing that. One of the reasons I'm optimistic is that, again, systems don't change steadily and in a linear process over a long time. Nothing seems to happen for a very long time, and then suddenly, badoom, things happen in a short order. And I think we're moving into a period where some of those exponential trends start to operate at the systemic level in ways that we have very little experience of, maybe with the internet, one or two other examples like that. But the critical element in all of this is the trends that we're most interested in are intrinsically exponential. And it's easy to say that, but when you're right in the midst of it, it's very hard to see sometimes these things coming. So some of you will have seen these sorts of forecasts. The grey lines are what very intelligent, sophisticated analysts have been saying what's going to happen in solar, electric vehicles, and battery sales. And the red lines are what's actually happening. Technology is not going to save us, but behind the scenes, the landscape is shifting very powerfully. And this example of a robot is just an indication of, people used to laugh at the idea that robots would play a role, for example, in boardrooms. And yet I work in boardrooms where they now have expert systems that are part of the discussion. And people are feeling existentially challenged about AI. Frankly, I don't think we can deal with our systemic challenges unless we use AI in the right way, which is one of the reasons I've been visiting some of the key players in that space. And underlying all of this is what I think is happening. When I first started, before the triple bottom line and so on, business was distinct from these change agendas. Then we had overlap, triple bottom line, shared value, ESG, all good stuff, and people trying to open out that middle zone. But this is Future Fit Foundation, and what they're basically saying is that increasingly, we've got to see business as part of much bigger, much more complicated systems. And this is the missing part very often. We've focused on individual companies and their boards and their brands and their business models and their supply chains. And what we've often forgotten is the market context within which they operate. And the question is, how do we design or redesign markets in such a way that doing the right thing, choose your issue, becomes the default setting? So why regeneration in all of this? Why do I think this term is so central and so important? I was 7 years on the faculty of the World Economic Forum. I wasn't there this year, but this was, some of you will have seen this, the outcome when they polled several thousand people who took part. 5 of the key challenges are environmental. I won't go through them. But the ones that we're going to have to deal with are these, the sort of rather more colorful ones. So societal polarization, a range of other things, misinformation, disinformation, AI, cyber insecurity, and so on, that are playing into that, and forced migration, obviously an increasingly important factor, both in European and in the US elections. Now, the reason I think regeneration is really important is I think it's much harder to game than it is sustainability. People can say, and I've heard the language today, sustainable this, sustainable that. And then what's the definition? regeneration is much harder to pretend to be delivering. This is the Eden Project, one of the things I've tracked since the 1970s. Some of you will know it in southwest of my country, the United Kingdom, and it's pulled in over 20 million visitors. It's put over £2 billion into the local economy. That's regeneration at scale, and that used to be a huge, great quarry, English china clay. And just for anyone who hasn't come across the work of Paul Hawken, this book of his, Regeneration, I recommend really, really highly. I think it should become a primer in this space of ours, whatever sector, whatever geography we're talking about. And then just to look at why I feel regeneration is so important. Here's a Spanish company that we've been working with, Acciona, and they do huge, great infrastructure projects. I visited a subway system that they're building in Sao Paulo, for example, and their chairman asked us, take 28 of our fast-track executives from around the world, work with them, come back with a 5-year master plan for sustainability. So we started the process. At the end, the young people said, no, we're not going to do a 5-year strategy. We're going to do a 10-year strategy. And it's not going to just be about sustainability, so you can play with that with other things. It's going to be for the business as a whole. And overarching that, the catch line, the byline, is going to be regenerative by design. What's been really interesting is they started to train the people who are doing the face-to-face first interviews with potential clients to work out how best to communicate that regenerative story. I don't love Walmart. Some of you may interact with them in different ways. Doug McMillan, not so long ago, pledged that regenerative farming was going to be increasingly part of what Walmart does. PepsiCo, Unilever, Nestle, Danone, the list of major companies that are coming into that regenerative farming space is very, very significant. So it's building. Last couple of slides. I visited a Kikkoman plant about 40 years ago in Japan. They make soy sauce, as you will well know. And the question that I'm playing with now, having listened to you all so far today, is standard-setting bodies tend to take a system as it is and think, how can we make it a bit better? And how can we encourage mass adoption of our standards? Maybe, in addition to all of that, we should be thinking about something a little bit more ambitious. So people have been talking about patience. I think we've also got to have a sense of urgency. And we saw Greta, and I had not heard him described as Big Bill before, but Bill Clinton. I'm somewhere in the spectrum between them. But the question that is in my mind is whether your platforms, your initiatives, your associations, your federations could launch a market campaign over the next decade focusing on soil health. Lieven said it this morning very, very eloquently, the different ways in which the health of ecosystems plays back into human and community health. So final slide. Just to say, if you're going to do anything like that, it's really, really important to be optimistic, to project hope. I think one of the things that really worries me most at the moment is the way that younger people are losing hope in the future, that they sense increasingly that the climate problem is out of control. So you have eco-anxiety. Build the science, but don't just simply build it for your own sake. Communicate the science to the wider world, and some of that I've already heard. Take key stakeholders with you, whether that's field trips, and you've been doing that here this year. Do inspire the wider world, so publish stretch targets, but you will sometimes and often, if they're really stretched, miss them. Explain why that has happened. And then finally, get younger people involved. I mean, it's easy to say. I've been in sessions where people have done mock or prototype youth boards, and it doesn't work terribly well. But the question is, over time, how do we get younger people more actively involved in constructing and designing and delivering some of these critical initiatives? And although certification is incredibly important, the real challenge is going to be building markets. So how do you build customer demand and beyond that consumer demand in a way that really drives action over time? So that's it from me. Fernanda, I'm coming back to join you. Thank you. Thank you.
So I have a few questions for John, just listening to him, but also soon we're going to open to all of you and we're going to throw this thing around. So feel like get started with your questions, what you would like John to talk a bit more about.
And you can be as rude as you like. Yeah.
Sure. So one of the things I was thinking is that often leadership has this connotation of individuals or individual organizations and how they can be green swans or leaders and pioneers. But as we're here in association, I would like you to maybe talk a little bit more about what can be achieved in this more collective way, maybe particularly towards markets, and also what are potential limitations of that.
Well, the limitations are relatively easy to spot, and among them are the facts that various people have already referenced today. If you're going to properly engage stakeholders, it takes more time. And particularly if you're going to engage stakeholders who do not yet fully understand what it is you're trying to do and why it's important and how they might check as that goes forward, whether it's working or not. So that's in a way why I think anything that is going to be convincing or persuasive to the wider world has to have a longer time scale. So that goes to the patience point, but I think it's also got to be able to demonstrate a real sense of urgency. So those World Economic Forum 10 priorities, that was for the next decade. I haven't heard yet today people, when I've been listening and reading between the lines, what I've heard is be patient, it's already happening, it's happening at some considerable scale, up to a point. And I think the fact is that most of what you're doing is really worth having. It's sensible, it's professionally delivered, it's all the rest of it. Is it enough? It absolutely is not. And therefore the question we've all got to ask of ourselves is, in 2020, about 2 weeks before COVID hit, we did a major conference with Aviva, big insurance and investment company. And on the wall, as people came into the conference center in their headquarters building in the center of the financial center in London, we had this message, and it said, step up or get out of the way. And I think we've all got to challenge ourselves in terms of what are we doing? Is it being effective? How would we know? And so to your question about collectives of people, groups of people, whether that's a board or that's a C-suite or whatever, it's very easy to, sorry, I keep losing control of my headset, but it's very easy to think that you can pull in people like you and get good outcomes. I think we've got to become more comfortable with being less comfortable and pulling in people who are not like us, who have really challenging views. And it's easier said that than done, but I think that's a central challenge for us all.
Thank you, John. I was also a bit curious because you said we might be coming into this down period for ESG and sustainability. And I think a lot of people in the room might be feeling also a bit despondent, maybe after having worked for a decade or more on this great standards, on issues that were not demanded yet, to see maybe some regulations or some progress that does fall short from maybe their dreams and hopes. So if you're in that moment in which maybe you feel you did a lot of effort but it's not quite showing, how do you move forward? Like, what could be a way for this group of people that have done this work to move forward?
Well, this isn't going to sound very encouraging, but of the 6,000 chief sustainability officers I referenced a moment ago, I suspect something like 1,000 to 2,000 will not be in those roles in a couple of 2 to 3 years, because either they're not fit for purpose, And there's some wonderful people in that role. But also because a lot of them are storytellers, and they're good at stakeholder engagement. They're not good at data. And increasingly what we've got to do is to make sure that everything that we do is informed by data and driven by the right sort of data and the right sort of market intelligence. What would I say to people? Get used to it, in a sense, because this whole change agenda is in the process of becoming radically politicized. And for a very long time, activists, and you kindly said I'm an activist. I've never been the Greta sort of activist, but I've worked with the Greenpeaces and so on of this world over decades. But I've always felt that you have to be both inside and outside the system at the same time. You also have to understand that things sometimes go forward and sometimes they go backwards. And sometimes they go backwards in a really big way. And in 1981, I went up in the Rockies in the United States, visited a mining company. And a vice president then told me something that's always stuck in my mind. He said, the thing to remember about American politics is that it's like a grandfather clock. There's a pendulum, and sometimes it goes so far one way that when it comes back, it crashes through the wall of the clock. And that's where I think we are now. Now, I don't for a moment try and make us all feel comfortable that Trump's going to be delightful. He really is an agent of chaos. But maybe we can use the chaos that he brings and the disruption that he brings to play into system change. And it's wonderful to hear terms like transition and transformation and system change being used in an event like this. If I think 10 years back, that would have not been the case. But then the question is that going to be comfortable and easy to manage and predictable? It absolutely will not be. And maybe this is a huge opportunity to come up with a very different change agenda that doesn't just appeal to our liberal bubble, but actually some of the people who are being dispossessed by some of these big, particularly technology changes, but also macroeconomic and geopolitical changes as well. But just very quickly,
yes.
The next 10 to 15 years, I did say, will be the most exciting. I said I've worked in this field for the last 50 years. The next 10 to 15 years are going to be stunningly interesting, but incredibly challenging. And that's why I say step up or get out of the way. We've all got to come up very, very steep learning curves in very short order. And I just thank you all, because this morning has been an extraordinary opportunity for me to come up a very particular learning curve.
I mean, I could keep doing this for a long time, but maybe we'll just have a chance to hear from the room. If you want to have a question or comment, could you raise your hand? We'll send
People
this
are
your way.
nervous about being thrown the brick.
Well, we'll gently do it.
So you need to hold it like this and speak into the box. Hello, this is Bernard Frey with EFRAG, formerly also with the UN Global Compact. Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to know, you mentioned briefly before AI and ESG. Where do you see the greatest opportunities for AI in advancing sustainability?
Thank you. And I liked your presentation this morning, and I think EFRAG has been a really important player in this space for a long period of time. When I think about AI, about 7, 8 years ago, I became quite interested in what was happening in that space. So I sort of started to get in touch with some of the companies that I was already working with, like HP and Palo Alto. I visited companies like DeepMind before they were acquired by Google. I talked to Google themselves, trying to get a sense of who was driving the AI technology. And what really astonished me, and particularly at DeepMind, was that the people that I was talking to were about a third of my age. That's not hard to do. Their brains worked about 15 to 17 times faster than mine does. I mean, it's really these are extraordinary people. But time and again, they were most interested in addressing the sort of challenges that we're talking about today. So they were really seeing opportunities there. What worries me, I also worked with the biotechnology and genetic engineering sector for 20 years. And in the early days, I saw exactly the same. Young biologists, biotechnologists, genetic engineers saying, we're going to solve energy problems, we're going to solve toxic land contamination problems, we're going to solve all of these critical challenges. But then the money took them somewhere quite different. The money took them to cancer and HIV/AIDS and things like that. So the question is, how do we keep the AI community focused on some of the things that we really need them to focus on? And when I asked groups like DeepMind, who have you talked to, remember this was 7 or 8 years ago, who have you talked to from the sustainability world? The answer was, what? You're the first person to actually sort of come across the frontier. So we've got to be in there now. And just a tiny example of what I think AI can deliver. There's a German company that makes electromagnets. You will know that electromagnets are made out of rare earth metals. The question they asked themselves was, can we make magnets with fewer rare earth metals? They set AI on the challenge. They looked at more than 100 million compounds, and at the end of it, they found that they could actually make electromagnets with no rare earth metals. The concern being China increasingly controls that set of supply chains. So no rare earth metals, 80% cheaper. The research project took months, not a decade, as would have been normal, and the carbon emissions were cut by 70%. That's the sort of radical innovation and disruptive change which I think AI can bring if we get in there soon enough and work with these people. At the moment, everyone's focused on the energy footprint, carbon footprint of data centers and so on, and we should be focusing there, but I think we've got to do the other piece as well. Would love to continue the conversation. Well caught.
Hi, John. Fantastic presentation. And I'm going to talk to you through this box here. I was just thinking about your comments about the Trump administration. I think a lot of people, particularly people more concerned with sustainability, might be not in a very good space and thinking that, you know, as you suggested, it's going to promote chaos, to use your words. But how can we really explain and demonstrate to the companies which are, as you mentioned, the major consumer goods companies, which are really responsible for driving a lot of this change, that it is, like you say, a pendulum, and it's going to swing back in a very short period of time? What's the best way to articulate that?
Well, it's interesting, and thank you for the question. But even before Trump was elected, one of the things, if you paid attention, was already happening. I was, for example, 6 weeks ago, I was in Stuttgart with Mercedes-Benz. Their CEO had just announced that they were going to fail deliberately to achieve their 100% electric vehicle target by 2030. Unilever had just backed off, Heinz Schumacher, their CEO, had just backed off some of their critical targets. Volvo, Ford on diversity, inclusion, equity. So you were already seeing companies starting to say, we can't deliver against some of the really ambitious commitments, promises that we've made. The answer is, the reason is because they're bumping up against what markets will currently allow them to do. What I would say to people in some of these critical companies in terms of driving this agenda is you're going to have to focus, and that is going to be political because there's going to be some people who just do not agree with your priorities as they go forward. But one of the things that we've been doing, and I mentioned Unilever, is looking at the way in which major leadership companies have joined and are part of industry federations, trade associations in different parts of the world. And the question that Unilever raised for us was, we've made these public declarations around, in this case, climate change. We know we're belonging to hundreds of federations and initiatives around the world. What are they saying? No one had been bothering to pay attention. So we've done the analysis, and it turns out that a quarter, all of this is public information now, but a quarter of Unilever's memberships are of platforms and associations and federations which are arguing completely the opposite way on climate change. So I think increasingly we've got to see major companies addressing that issue. It's not going to get them a huge amount of publicity, and in some cases it may actually lead to a sort of certain amount of pushback. But I think we will see retreat. We're already seeing it. So I think we've got to be in there, just encouraging people to think a little bit more widely, look at some of the examples where people are continuing to make progress, understand why that's happening, what works and what doesn't. But it's going to be a difficult 2 to 3 years. That is absolutely, and I've worked through the Nixon period, I worked through the Reagan period in the United States, and in each of those periods you had a retreat for a period of time. But what's really, if I'm right about that underlying paradigm shift, or I could perhaps do it that way, what happens is that for 18 months to 3 years, you have a period where people try and cut back, and then they screw up. And then what happens is the change agenda reverts to where it would otherwise been. But the change is much harder for the companies that are having to adapt, and much more damaging if they haven't done very much in the meantime. So that doesn't save you in the next 18 months to 2 years, but that I think is what's going to happen. The question is, can you explain that to people coherently?
Thank you, John. Yes, John from Paraguay RTRS board. You mentioned the market transformation that you're expecting to happen in the next 10 or 15 years. Can you also mention some of the key drivers that will lead us to this market transformation according to your expectations?
Well, I think thank you very much for the question. And I think the technology story is one part of it. But technology very often comes with very different business models, and the business models are also an incredibly important part of it all. But I think there's something even more profound. And I don't know what the average age of this room is, but I've looked at the panels earlier on today, and the average age is probably half my age, but it's still, older than most younger people are, with the greatest of respect. And the reason I raise that is, I'm a baby boomer. If you look at the demographic transition that is coming, baby boomers will be out of the picture within about 5-7 years. It doesn't mean that they won't be alive, they will be. And the problem there is older people tend to continue to vote. They tend to be increasingly conservative, so they're voting conservative. We saw it in my own country, it was referenced earlier on with Brexit. So older people vote against younger people. And so one of the things I think we've got to do, and one of the things I think will, over time, drive market transformation, is that younger people they will not want to save the world just on their own, but they will be increasingly concerned about some of the issues we're discussing here today. So, for example, Nature magazine did a survey about 2 years ago, and I don't know where you would think eco-anxiety, young people being concerned about climate change, would be at its greatest. The answer is Indonesia, the Philippines, and there are Brazilians in the room, but Brazil. And in Europe, it was Portugal, because there had been a whole series of fires there. So this is not necessarily happening where we're expecting it to happen. And the question in my mind, just to conclude, is this going to go peacefully, or is it going to go another route? And the reason I say that is I went to university first time in the 1960s. One of my friends, I thought I knew her quite well, went to prison for 10 years for trying to blow up British government ministers. I had a number of friends in Hamburg in Germany. 2 of those later on turned out to be part of the Baader-Meinhof support group. In fact, they killed the father of somebody who later became a friend of mine. And I looked afterwards, you might not be surprised, think, am I just very bad at picking my friends? And that may be part of the answer. But what I concluded was these were very well educated, they were all at university people, They were concerned about the wider world. They felt they tried to engage the system and have a meaningful conversation, but had been rejected, been rebuffed. And so they became angry. And Anna Mendelsohn, my friend at university, she was part of something called the Angry Brigade. Do not expect young people to continue to accept chaos if they begin to see that chaos as being imposed on them by older people. Now, I'm not saying that's guaranteed. I'm not saying it's even the major driver, but we've got to get ahead of that. We've got to give people hope. We've got to give people a sense of progress. And that's where I think a regenerative initiative starting with soy, but then expanding to other commodities, could be quite an interesting game to play. I see you.
John, can I ask a question?
You're going to, whether I say yes or no, James.
So you mentioned this idea that we need to bring into the room people that are not here,
Yeah.
right? And then you went on and said that we need to see we're going to see a shift from storytellers to data presenters.
We need both. Yeah.
Okay, because I get the sense that how do you bring people into the room that aren't part of this bubble? And what I've seen is data often has the opposite effect.
Yeah.
Right? So you show me your data and I'll show you my data that disproves your data.
Yeah.
And actually, it's the storytelling that seems to be a better way sometimes to bring in those different voices, the divergent voices as well. So would love your thoughts on that.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things I've done, I'm often asked by younger people, how can you possibly stay optimistic and engaged when so often things seem to go in the wrong direction? And the part of the answer is I do what I was recommending earlier on that you all do, which is to go out and see people working on, in this case, regeneration. And for example, I was saying earlier on today, I was in Romania about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and I was speaking at a big conference in Bucharest on sustainable leadership, whatever that might be. And I said, well, since I'm there, I want to go and see the Danube Delta, and I want to go and see some of the regeneration projects. And if you go and see some of these things as they're being done, taken around by people who are actually engaged in doing them, that's very exciting. But you also learn other things. So, for example, with one of the really big regeneration projects in the Danube Delta, it's suddenly doubled in size because it's about flooding what used to be agricultural land and turning it into basically a rewilding project. The hotel revenues in the region and locality have gone up 3-fold since that happened because people are streaming through to see the wildlife. They polled the local people to see what support there was in the region, expecting quite a lot of resistance. 97% of ordinary people felt this was the right way to go. So I find going to see people working on making what seems to be impossible possible and then inevitable is incredibly encouraging. And so to your question, James, I think storytelling is vital, but you've got to be aware that the story that you're telling is based in science, is based in facts, and that's where I think data does come in. Will there be competing stories? Absolutely, because the very fact that we've got this pushback increasingly, it reflects something I think is really optimistic. The reason we're getting the pushback, in part, is because there are a bunch of people in fossil fuels and areas like that who know that what's coming threatens their vested interests. So they're going to be spinning their own stories. So this is going to be an interesting period in so many different ways. But again, the storytelling thing I would love to discuss with you more, because it's not going Disney, it's not going Hollywood, but very often our stories are not yet powerful enough. They're not yet convincing enough. You just look at recent elections, and that's very clear. So how do we make them properly engaging and increasingly powerful?
One more question from the room.
Well, these people.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yep.
Yes, yeah, it's great.
Mitchell Santos, Bungie. One quick comment question. You were saying very wisely that there are so many benefits from soybean that maybe we could promote better, and still soybean is seen as something evil in the food value chain. But from our perspective, from the industry, farmers, and even the association is going to be biased or considered as biased because we will be talking about ourselves, our own business, by our own interest. So what would be your suggestion for us to bring the right senses and right lenses that you just shown in terms of the benefits of soybean, not only for nutritional facts that you were skipping that, but for the soil as a whole?
Well, I've been a vegetarian mainly for 50 years, so I've been quite dependent at times on the soybean. So thank you for your contribution on that front. But can I confess ignorance? Before I came here and before I got some sort of briefing ahead of coming to this event, I knew very little about soybean. I knew very little. I knew it was a nitrogen fixer, but I didn't know the sort of impacts it can have on soil structure and things like that. So I had to come up a learning curve. And when I think about the spaces in which I operate, I think your story, which you've just headlined in a way, is completely unknown to the wider world, including some of the critical stakeholders who will have an influence going forward. And that's why I think setting some sort of ambitious public target from which you won't then walk away, as some of these other companies have been doing, partly because it's a process of exploration, that you're going to explore how soybean can be part of a properly regenerative economy, but to be able to do that in a trustworthy way, in a way that people will have confidence in what you're saying. And this is where it becomes very difficult for industry and trade associations and federations. You are going to have to criticize bad behavior by people in your sector. And when it comes to it, you're going to have to get rid of members who are not performing against the new expectations. But unless and until you start to do that, I think you're going to continue to wrestle with those broader public trust problems. But again, I was very impressed by what I found as I came up that learning curve. Although, I think soybean followed by cotton, it's a balance. So I'm committed to coming further up the learning curve if I can once control this headset. But thank you for the question.
So we're coming to the end of this conversation, of the session, but John will be around as well later for people to engage with him, probably in the queue. I just wanted to thank you very much. And I think the end of this conversation with Michelle's question, but also with you talking about stories, talking about what you've learned, is going to lead very well into the afternoon, where we have 2 panels on regenerative agriculture, and we're going to see exactly those examples that you visited in the Danube, but you could also be in Brazil, seeing some of that happening in farms. Maybe just one final question would be: you said maybe we did a lot, but didn't do enough yet. What would enough look like?
I don't know, because I don't know your sector well enough. But it would, for example, mean that by 2035, somewhere between 50 and 70% of your sector was properly defined regenerative. But that would be enough. No one expects you to be 100% sorry, regenerative by then. I'm getting emotional. But the thing that strikes me about the round table is how rare, how extraordinary your, dear God, sorry,
No,
somebody's trying to stop me, and they're succeeding. The level of conversation that I've heard here today has been very rare. It's not unique, but that means that you're in a position to declare a commitment and to move forward at a time when people are starting to talk regeneration, but not knowing practically what it will involve for them. So I think as a demonstrator of what's possible, I heard the Mato Grosso story today, and again, it's part of this political challenge that we've got to face. But if we're truly going to talk about system change, and deliver anything like it, we've got to do the politics as well. And that means dealing with, understanding, and compensating some of the people who are going to lose most from the transition that we're trying to push forward. So if you could declare something like a 50% or a 70% or whatever commitment by the end of 10, even 15 years, I'd be interested. Whether that would satisfy everyone else, I don't know.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.